Everybody knows that children are a big expense, but not everyone realizes that making babies or even freezing the wish to have children can actually be a big source of income. Back in 2014, the rumor that big tech companies paid their female staff for freezing their egg cells made global headlines.
Tech giants Apple and Facebook say they will foot the bill for employees who want
Facebook will pay for their female employees to freeze their eggs, according to an NBC.
Women who elect to freeze their eggs.
Less than 5 years later, a big American fertility business called Progeny celebrated their flotation on the stock market. The fertility market was officially open for big bucks.
When I got into fertility, I raised the first 100 million and it went very well. I was on the cover of Forbes magazine when we raised the money.
Healthcare is a growth business and everybody will always need healthcare. And as we get older, we're probably all going to need more healthcare. But of course, the fertility world is very commercialized already.
Online advertising is everywhere now, promoting the baby-making industry.
We'll do everything we can to make your dream real.
Geld speelt natuurlijk ook wel een rol. Tussen de 2500 à 3000 euro per punctie.
I think private equity money is interested in the fertility industry for a number of reasons. When people want to have children, they prioritize their expenses in relation to reproductive treatments, even if there is a recession.
Como banco de óvulos, nos gustaría mandar a cualquier rincón del mundo, obviamente, siempre que sea legal. En un futuro el sexo será el sexo y los hijos vendrán por ahí bien.
I'm a technology entrepreneur focused on healthcare and focused specifically on fertility. I started getting involved with the field of fertility when my wife and I had difficulties having a baby. So we entered the field of fertility as patients. We then successfully had 3 children. And while being a patient in the US, because this was happening in the US, in Miami, while at the waiting room of the fertility clinic, I thought like a tech entrepreneur, this is just so poorly organized. Like I felt fertility could be greatly improved.
More and more people want to postpone having children, and when they do want them, it often turns out to be very difficult. Martin Versavsky experienced this himself, but being an entrepreneur, he also saw a market for it. He became a big player, offering a technological solution to the problem.
I think having a biological clock made a lot of sense when people died at 35, which is only 150 years ago. We now have the first generation of women who will spend more time in menopause than they spent fertile. So why should women pack all their children very early in such a long life? I think we will be able to get rid of the biological clock by what Prelude offers now, my clinics and many other clinics, but we're the #1 group of clinics in the US offering this, which is egg freezing. We're the leaders in egg freezing in the US, and egg freezing is a very good way to stop the biological clock. If you think of fertility as a bread and an oven, meaning the embryo is the bread and the uterus is the oven, the problem, 95% of infertility cases of women are with the bread and 5% with the oven. The oven works. Of course, it doesn't work well if you don't have enough eggs. People want to party and have a good time and work. Spain has the lowest fertility of Europe, together with Italy. So by the time Spaniards want to have babies, they need to go to an IVF clinic, many of them. To give you a sense, the United States has 330 million people, and it has 200,000 IVF cycles. And Spain has 45 million people and has 100,000 IVF cycles. So Spanish are to fertility what Germans are to cars. I don't know, it's something that the fertility science has grown very well in Spain.
Spain has developed into the fertility paradise of Europe, offering lots of private clinics for IVF treatment. When there's nothing wrong with a woman's oven, as Martin the businessman puts it, but you have to work with ingredients past their sell-by date, there's a solution for that too. Egg cells stored in a bank.
En el 2012 no existía un banco de óvulos aquí en Europa. Entonces, bueno, yo venía de Estados Unidos, de estar trabajando en Estados Unidos, en Italia. Yo había hecho una serie de patentes de congelación celular y ya tuvimos esa idea de abrir un banco de óvulos, ¿no? Entonces, cuando abrimos la clínica, la primera clínica nuestra aquí en Marbella, al poquito tiempo, pues empecé con Ovobank, con el banco de óvulos. Bueno, que sería interesante, ¿no? Había bancos de semen, pero no había bancos de óvulos. En cada ovario, de forma natural, se empiezan a formar los folículos antrales, en los dos, ¿no? Se empiezan a formar los folículos antrales, alimentados por una hormona que tenéis vosotras que se llama la FSH. Ese folículo crece, el ovulito que está dentro, cuando tiene un tamaño aproximadamente de 18 milímetros, está maduro, explota y el ovulito sale del ovario. Y cuando se expulsa por la menstruación, empiezan a formarse nuevos folículos en los ovarios. Y empiezan a comer vuestro FSH. Empiezan a formarse muchos folículos, FSH es solo suficiente para un solo folículo, con lo cual ese folículo es el único que crece, los demás se reabsorben y ese folículo crece, ovulito, se ovula, recorre la trompa de falopio y se pierde por la menstruación. Eso es de forma natural. De forma artificial, lo que nosotros damos es FSH, con lo cual no solo un folículo crece, sino que todos los folículos crecen. Todos los folículos crecen. Y cuando todos los folículos tienen un tamaño de unos 18 milímetros aproximadamente, ahí es donde tenemos que entrar en quirófano, pinchar cada uno de esos folículos, extraer el líquido folicular y el ovulito que hay dentro, y en el laboratorio coger todos esos óvulos. Todos los óvulos que una mujer pierde de forma natural, nosotros los recuperamos todos. Y ya está. Por eso no es dañino, porque esos óvulos de todas maneras se pierden. Entonces te estáis perdiendo todos los meses 40, 50, 60 óvulos. Entonces con 37, 38, 39 años, pues la reserva ovárica está bajita. Es muy triste, pero bueno, para eso estamos nosotros. Gracias a eso comemos, ¿no? O sea, es decir, es una película triste, pero es la realidad.
Ahora vamos a proceder a pinchar todas esas celdas que se ven de color negro, que son los folículos, para tratar de extraer los óvulos. Vale, ¿ok? Nos posicionamos e introducimos la aguja al folículo.
In the 1990s, there was a slogan for young women: "Smart girls, prepare for the future." If you're smart, you think about your future and your independence. The government even had commercials made to encourage young women to make a career for themselves.
Vrijheid, zelfstandigheid. Een beetje, ja, zelfstandig zijn. Om zelf mijn keuzes te kunnen bepalen. Om niet afhankelijk te zijn van wie of wat dan ook.
Vanaf 1990 moet je als meisje op eigen benen kunnen staan. Een slimme meid is op haar toekomst voorbereid.
These days, women who wish to postpone having children can have their eggs frozen for the future. There's a special Future Mother Cafe to inform women about this option. Apparently, the new motto is Smart Girls Prepare to Freeze Time.
Welkom in het kinderwenscafé voor vrouwen die overwegen om hun eicellen in te vriezen.
Ik heb in de presentatie wat plaatjes gezet, omdat ik denk dat het als leek best leuk is om iets meer van de magie te zien.
Leuk, ja. Nou, voor steeds meer vrouwen is het bekend dat je vruchtbaarheid afneemt met je leeftijd. Dus dat je naarmate je ouder wordt minder kans hebt om zwanger te worden. Want je bent niet oneindig lang vruchtbaar. We leren natuurlijk met z'n allen op de middelbare school bij seksuele voorlichting vooral hoe je niet zwanger moet worden. Hoe je dat moet voorkomen. Maar dit soort dingen, dat vertelt niemand je.
We spend so much time trying to prevent unwanted pregnancy that we've forgotten the other side of family planning and actually telling and educating women about the impact of time on their biological options. And if you look at the strategies and the campaigns to reduce unwanted pregnancies in teenagers, they've been hugely successful. But have we failed a generation of women that have now got into their 40s and decide they now want to have children and realize that the biology has been against them?
Fertility specialist Stuart Lavery saw many women come and go, asking for an IVF treatment because they'd left it too late. A lot of them tried in vain. Lavery started his own private clinic, offering his clients the technology of freezing their egg cells.
The huge thing that women have had to deal with for generations is the age-related biological clock that has been ticking. And the science is currently available to allow those women the option of storing their eggs, potentially to use them in the future. And I think probably the closest thing to this is what happened in the 1960s and early 1970s with the advent of the oral contraceptive pill. That gave women power, it gave women choice and autonomy over their own reproductive lives, about deciding when maybe they didn't want to have a baby. This technology may be the flip side of that coin. And it may be the ultimate in family planning to allow you to have a baby at the time of your choice.
Heel veel vrouwen die ik ken, die hebben helemaal niet een behoefte op een bepaalde leeftijd gesetteld te zijn. Je maakt carrière, je bent bezig met opleidingen, met ontwikkelmogelijkheden, reizen, alles. En dan haalt de biologie eigenlijk gewoon een beetje in.
Vrouwen zeggen, ja, toen ik nog begin 30 was ik eigenlijk helemaal niet zo bezig met die kinderwens. En ik dacht, die prins op het witte paard, die komt er wel voorbij. Dus ik heb nog wel die tijd, totdat je op een gegeven moment ouder wordt en dan denkt, oh.
Ik weet wel dat ik een kinderwens heb, maar voor mijn gevoel wil ik dat als ik groot ben, als ik later groot ben. Alleen realiseer ik me soms dat ik al best wel groot ben.
Ja, het is eigenlijk heel gek dat iedereen het ergens wel weet. Maar nou ja, wat jij zei, ik ben 30 jaar, ik dacht daar totaal niet over na.
What's really attracted me to this field of egg freezing has been my experience in looking after women coming in at age 42 trying for their first baby. And the reality of us being able to help those women and help them have a baby at age 42, it's really low. And it's not unusual for women to say to me, I wish I'd have frozen my eggs at 28 and I could use them now and have a really high chance of having a baby.
No se ve prácticamente líquido libre, salvo ese bolsillo.
Storing your eggs for the future is relatively new. In the Netherlands, for instance, it only became legal 10 years ago. Women who are too late to freeze their eggs may still turn to this Spanish embryologist on his Vespa, who very cleverly established a donor bank.
Pues ahora os vamos a enseñar el lugar donde preparamos los contenedores y donde mandamos las células a los distintos centros colaboradores a los cuales mandamos las células. Entonces, este es el área de envíos. Aquí los chicos de este departamento preparan los contenedores, meten los óvulos dentro de los contenedores y se ocupan de que estos contenedores vayan a las clínicas que usan nuestros óvulos. Y nos vienen muchísimos pacientes de fuera de España a hacerse tratamientos de ovodonación aquí, tipo Italia, tipo Inglaterra, tipo Francia, tipo Alemania, tipo Holanda, porque en cada país hay una legislación distinta. Y en muchos países la legislación o prohíbe o imposibilita o hace que la donación de óvulos no sea muy fácil o no haya muchas donantes. Por lo que pacientes de esos países que necesitan donación de óvulos vienen a España porque nosotros sí tenemos muchas donantes.
¿Por qué?
Y aquí en España la donación de óvulos se está haciendo desde hace muchísimos años y hoy actualmente no hay una chica de 20 años o 22 años que tú le propongas ser donante y no sepa lo que es la donación de óvulos. En España se permite la publicidad a la hora de buscar donantes. Con lo cual, al abrir Ovobank, pues abrimos una caja de Pandora que no sabíamos dónde nos iba a llevar. En Marbella hay una variabilidad fenotípica espectacular, porque aquí hay rusos viviendo, noruegos viviendo, españoles por supuesto, italianos, franceses, austríacos, de todas las nacionalidades. Aquí hay 150 nacionalidades distintas. Entonces nosotros los profesionales cuando asignamos una donante a una paciente tiene que ser lo más parecido posible a esa paciente. Si la paciente es rubia con ojos azules no le damos una donante morena con ojos negros.
¿Pero se puede exprimir el valor? ¿Tiene un valor intrínseco?
No, es cero. El valor es cero. Legalmente es cero. El óvulo no cuesta dinero. No se puede ni comprar ni vender.
Aquí.
En el mundo. Bueno, perdón, en el mundo. Aquí, en Europa. Estados Unidos es mucho más comercial. En Estados Unidos el óvulo cuesta dinero. O sea, un óvulo son $5.000, por ejemplo. ¿Cómo le das valor a un óvulo? En Estados Unidos, por ejemplo, hay óvulos de rubias con ojos azules californianas universitarias que cuestan más que morenas con ojos marrones de Miami. Hay donantes que cobran más que otras donantes. Porque el paciente paga más. Al final aquello es la ley de la demanda, oferta y demanda, ¿no? Yo tengo un paciente que paga $20.000 o $30.000 por esta donante rubia californiana, pero este mismo paciente me paga $5.000 por esta de Miami, ¿no? Porque es menos apetecible. Es distinto, es un mundo completamente distinto.
Joining me now from Cambridge in the UK is Dr. Lucy van der Wiel, a research associate at the Reproductive Sociology Research Group at Cambridge University and author of Freezing Fertility. Lucy, thank you so much for your time. So with this new research, should we stop regarding the age of 35 as a fertility cliff?
The question of 35 is also very much not just a biological question, but a social question. It's linked to a history of of concern around the biological clock. And that issue of the biological clock is aroused in...
Lucy van der Wiel conducts a study on how our ideas and actions concerning fertility are changing, thanks to these new technologies that claim to turn back your biological clock.
What's really interesting about egg freezing is that it's changed our idea and our feeling around fertility. So there is this sense that we kind of become infertile earlier because the decision about should you treat yourself now in order to avoid infertility in the future is something that has become relevant at increasingly early ages. And at the same time, the idea that when egg freezing wasn't available, the idea that at some point you lose your fertility and that's over, is now also changing in character, because it can become something like, oh, if only I had frozen my eggs, I could have conceived a child now. Or I'm trying to get pregnant and it doesn't work, if only I'd frozen my eggs 10 or 5 years earlier. So there is this kind of dynamic that there is more agency around it, and a different experience of fertility as something that infertility becomes more relevant earlier on, but also fertility stays relevant later on in life as well.
De enige zekerheid die je hebt, of die je koopt, is dat je dan een kans hebt die je anders nu gehad zou hebben. Dat is de enige zekerheid die je koopt. En verder niet.
What happens with egg freezing is that more uncertain idea around fertility, or the idea that you have to manage it rather than that it's just a given, is something that comes with an increased sense of risk. But also, in order to mitigate that risk, you become dependent. You become dependent on technologies, you become dependent on companies, you become dependent on doctors. And so I think while sometimes it's presented as a way of being empowered, you also become more dependent. And it also means that you have to then invest and undergo particular medical risks and also financial risks in that respect. So it's definitely a double-edged sword.
Het heeft eigenlijk ook wel weer meteen de volgende vragen aangewakkerd voor mij. Oké, je gaat eicellen invriezen. Dat is het. Er gebeurt verder nog niks. Dat heeft geen impact op je leven. En ik dacht dat van nou, en dan heb ik dat in de vriezer en dan zien we wel. En, maar op een gegeven moment wordt dan eigenlijk verder, ja, maar dat heb ik natuurlijk gedaan met een reden, want ik wil eigenlijk wel graag moeder worden. En het maakt het allemaal wel veel echter. Van, je hebt er wel een beetje het gevoel van, nou, je hebt A gezegd en misschien moet ik dan ook B zeggen. Dus ja, het gaf me rust, maar niet zo lang als ik had gehoopt.
Voor mij was het juist een heel belangrijke overweging om het misschien wel niet te doen, was dat ik dus dan tot zelfs 49 jaar de optie openhoud. En het leek me onwijs onrustig. Toen dacht ik, ja, je kan ook denken, ja, je ligt je ergens bij neer. En het is maakbaar of niet. Gegeven dat iets wel of niet zo loopt, dat mag zo zijn of mag nog niet zo zijn. En ik dacht, volgens mij kan het me ook heel veel. Ik vond juist het hebben van een keuze zo'n luxe probleem. En ook daarmee iets heel moeilijks om daar tot een goede afweging in te komen. Dat heeft me heel veel onrust gekost. En dat eigenlijk denk ik hierna nog steeds.
Dus het zorgt er eigenlijk voor dat je denkt, ja, nu heb ik voor mezelf een soort keuze vooruit geduwd. Van, nou ja, dan heb ik nog even om daarover na te denken. Ja. Heb je eigenlijk nog hele zeeën van tijd gecreëerd.
Waar ik nu al de hele tijd zo mee. Dus misschien was het ook, ik dacht van, het zou ook wel heel rustgevend kunnen zijn. Maar gewoon dan om te denken, nee, klaar, dan niet. Boekje dicht.
I think it does bring extra pressure and extra choices on women. And although usually I think having choice is a good thing, there's no doubt that sometimes choice brings more anxiety. But there is a concern around the commercialization of this, because many women that are freezing will not need the eggs. They will get pregnant the old-fashioned way with a partner. And so we have to be very careful about persuading women to do this, when most women probably won't need it. And I do have concerns where organizations are run purely as commercial businesses, where the drive may be to advertise based on fear. And that's certainly not the right way we should be handling this.
She's known as the egg whisperer.
Glossy online commercials target hip millennials.
Make sure that everyone knew that they can freeze their eggs, just like everyone knows that they can get their boobs done.
They promise guaranteed fertility in the future and bandy about words like self-determination and empowerment, all with a glossy layer of buyable success.
In the US, they have some companies that really try to shift the focus from the group that currently freezes their eggs to a younger group of women. And so the idea is that they would convince women, say even in their 20s, to freeze their eggs. Sometimes this is explained with an idea of peak fertility. So rather than freezing fertility in general, they say you should freeze your fertility when you're at your peak. And then they would use marketing techniques like, for example, one company has fertility vans. So that's like a little bus that drives through city centers in New York and San Francisco, for example. And then they also offer free fertility testing. So women can then have their hormones checked to see how fertile they are. And so that's one way in which it's presented. And then one of the things that they say, for example, in that context would be, you'll never be more fertile than you are today. So there's really that sense of you have to capture your fertility now before it's too late. And if you are never more fertile than you are today, then every day you're virtually losing your fertility. So it's kind of instilling this sense of urgency, and it's often combined with a sense of empowerment, like we are empowering you to take control of your biological clock. But there's also the instilling of concern about it, where maybe there wasn't any concern before. If you talk about a company that would like to have more patients, then this would be a way of recruiting more people and making more people into patients.
Making babies used to be cheap. Most people still do it that way, in the bedroom, at no cost. But now we're made to think that we need to invest in our fertility for later. This is a market that plays on our fears for the future, a kind of insecurity capitalism.
So I think private equity money is interested in the fertility industry for a number of reasons, and one of them would be egg freezing, but also because fertility treatments in general are becoming more popular across the world, so more people are using all sorts of reproductive technologies. It's also something that's called resistant to the recession. And if a key goal of a fertility clinic or a fertility group is to grow, then egg freezing offers an opportunity to do that, because you can have more patients coming in for egg freezing specifically.
BPAS is a British organisation aiming to offer an alternative to the growing commercial fertility industry that makes so much money off people's hopes and fears. For over 50 years, BPAS has helped women terminate unwanted pregnancies. But today, they're literally building a non-profit fertility service for IVF treatment and freezing egg cells.
We will have 3 beds here and then a nurse's station there, so the nurses will be looking after the patient. And then we will egg collect, and the tubes with the fluid will be passed into the lab here for us to look for the eggs. Yes, this is going to be a door.
So this is going to be the UK's first not-for-profit IVF service. This is the hub. It's really exciting.
Yes. I had a bit of a problem with the issue that the private patients were paying in an NHS setting, the prices that are being asked for in the private sector, and a lot of the financial gain that the hospital was making was being used to supplement other departments. And often it is the doctors that own, the medical doctors that own the fertility services or that get the financial gain out of it. And in my view, you know, that's something that I'm very uncomfortable with, yeah.
What are you building here?
IVF clinic.
Do you know what they exactly do in an IVF clinic?
That's amazing.
Well, help women get pregnant and that, basically, yeah.
They give the woman the injections for her cycle to enlarge her ovaries, to release more eggs, then they extract the eggs, then they take a sperm sample from you, inseminate the eggs, put it in the laboratory, then put it in there. And when it gets to 12 or whatever cells, then they reinsert into the female. And 6 weeks later, they check the substrate.
You were a doctor? Can you say that one more time?
How come you know?
One of my ex-partners, we went through £25,000 worth of IVF.
You did?
Yeah, £25,000 worth of IVF. We was at Ilford in the Bupa.
then once you've started the treatment, it's impossible to get out of it. You are in a conveyor belt. So if people are offering you things that might help, it's basically impossible to say no. And those often come at an extra cost. So it's difficult for patients to budget for their fertility treatment. And we think that that is part of the challenge that people go through as well, the financial burden and the financial implications of not knowing how much money they'll have to pay. And I think it takes organizations like BPAS to really have at the core of what they do to help people rather than to have a financial gain out of a service. It takes an organization like this, and this is what BPAS is doing for abortion. Really, the core of what we are doing is to help people achieve their reproductive dreams one way or another. So support people to have the family they want to have at the point in time they want to have it.
En ik heb dit eigenlijk al gehad, dit verhaal. Ik heb al 2 keer zo'n traject doorgelopen. Dus ik heb 17 eicellen in de vriezer liggen. En dat vind ik ook wel mooi voor nu.
Ik heb 1 keer gedaan, ik heb er 9. Jij vertelt mij, ik heb het 2 keer gedaan. Ik heb er 17.
Ja, je hebt je onrust nu.
Ik voel de stress al. Moet ik het een tweede keer doen? Dat is nu wel de vraag die ik me stel. Moet ik dat nu een tweede keer doen of is 9 voldoende? Ik zie het niet zitten om een tweede keer te doen. Dus ik denk niet dat ik het zal doen.
Waar zie je dan vooral tegenop?
De behandeling. De behandeling.
Ja. Zowel lichamelijk als mentaal met je doet?
Ja, en de punctie was niet te onderschatten. Semisedatie, je voelt het wel. Ik heb daar zitten schreeuwen op die tafel. En zingen. Ze hebben mij gekalmeerd en zeiden, zing maar een liedje.
Welk liedje?
La vie en rose, Edith Piaf. Heb ik gezongen terwijl mijn eitjes... Ik dacht, voilà, mijn kindjes krijgen al een mooi liedje erbij. Ja, maar dit is eigenlijk de inhoud van... Ja, dus dit moet je dagelijks zelf eerst optrekken. Dat is ook iets dat je geen ervaring mee hebt. Dus je hebt een eerste spuit met een andere naald. Dus deze naald, waarbij dat je hier alles eruit moet zuigen. En dan moet je met een fijnere naald dit bij jezelf hier. Voilà. En dan... Het lukt hoor, maar met een traantje. De eerste keer met een traantje. Het is intens. En ik zie het niet zitten om dat een tweede keer te doen. Nee. Geld speelt natuurlijk ook wel een rol, het financiële aspect. Als er een terugbetaling zou zijn, ook al gedeeltelijk, dan zou ik wel een tweede keer misschien al eerder overwegen. Maar nu nog niet. Niet met dit kostenplaatje. Nee.
In England, one doctor claims to have an even better solution to freezing your eggs. One that doesn't involve so many painful procedures.
I'm Professor Simon Fischel. I come from a background in IVF, in vitro fertilization, being around at the very beginning over 40 years ago. I'm part of the world's first IVF clinic, in fact.
When Louise Brown was born as the first IVF baby in the world, everybody was outraged. A baby from a test tube. But this never deterred Dr. Fischel, back then the young doctor hovering over the Petri dishes in question. He is about to market a treatment traditionally used to help cancer patients retain their fertility, but now commercially available for any young woman.
We live in a world, this is how fast the world is changing, we live in a world where we can freeze eggs. But it was only about 10 years ago that you couldn't really freeze eggs. You could do it, but it was unsuccessful. It wasn't efficient enough for you to offer it as a proper medical procedure. So there was no option to freeze eggs. So what people were doing years before that, they were taking a bit of ovarian tissue because we know that's where the eggs are. And a woman is born with all the eggs that she'll ever have. In fact, she's born with a lot more than she needs, maybe about 2 million. And over time, they start to deteriorate. She gets to the menopause, she's got none left. So a woman has this pool of eggs that we call it. Now, when she's got a pool of eggs, it was believed that you could take that pool of eggs and you could take some of the ovarian tissue out. You could cut it up into tiny little pieces and freeze it. Years later, when she wanted to have children, you would take out the ovarian tissue, put it back into the same woman, and it would start producing eggs. Those eggs could be fertilized, and she's fertile. So they have preserved her fertility. There's another problem out there. Not just preserving fertility. Now, here's the interesting thing. If you want to restore your fertility, then you put it back near the reproductive organs so you can try to conceive naturally. But if you just want it to restore your hormones, you don't need to put it back near the reproductive organs. You could put it anywhere where there's a blood supply. I mean, you could actually put it under the armpit, for example. And as long as it has a blood supply, it will kickstart within about 3 months, and it will start producing the hormones.
One revolution has hardly been digested, and the next miracle is already being announced: the freezing of ovarian fragments. This would make it possible to delay menopause. Dr. Simon is the only physician in the UK licensed to offer this treatment on a non-medical basis. And according to him, the waiting lists are long.
Probably it's worth thinking that maybe the best we can do at the moment might be to prevent the menopause coming on for maybe 20 years. Even though, let's say it should have started when you were 50 and you'd frozen your tissue when you were 30, you may get enough opportunity to keep your hormones going to prevent the menopause, maybe until you're 70. So, we are already set up in Brazil. Parts of Asia we're going to be immediately involved in will be Thailand and China particularly, Hong Kong probably too. Brazil is quite fascinating because I would never really say this in the UK or other countries because we're not doing it for this reason, but the Brazilians latched onto this thinking, well, is it a kind of anti-aging? Is it a cosmetic procedure of benefit? And their way of thinking is actually, it's not unrealistic clinically to say that a lot of the benefits that you get from having a normal estrogenic state, such as the fineness of your skin and one of the problems is the dryness of the vagina and all the other mood swings, and apart from the serious conditions of osteoporosis and cardiovascular disease and declining cognitive function, there are the other sort of day-to-day health benefits that many women will lose. And we know the Brazilians are one of the probably, if not the highest, one of the highest in the world that love cosmetic surgery, love to keep themselves vibrant and feeling young. And they think this is going to help them. And, I would actually not disagree that it's got potentially those kind of benefits too, because that's one of the big differences between postmenopause and premenopause, is the level of estrogen and how it's delivered physiologically in the body. Well, if you can maintain that period of time, many people would want to do that for other reasons than just clinical reasons.
Egg freezing has revolutionized egg donation as well. So that's moving eggs from one woman into another woman. So previously you needed to have 2 women in the same room around the same time in order to do that procedure. But now that you have frozen eggs, you can move the eggs across time and across space. So technically, a woman can donate her eggs in one country and a woman can receive those eggs in another country if the eggs get shipped in liquid nitrogen tanks from one place to the other. But you can also have a much greater distance in time. So a woman may donate her eggs and another woman might receive those eggs maybe 10 years later. You get a very different dynamic in terms of what egg donation is and to what extent women get to know each other and how they choose an egg donor, for example.
Hay pacientes que quieren ver la foto de la donante por curiosidad, pero hay pacientes que quieren elegir a su donante, y eso es lo que es ilegal aquí, ¿no? Entonces nosotros inventamos un sistema, readaptamos un sistema que por reconocimiento facial la paciente se puede hacer un selfie y por 150 puntos faciales, distancia de la nariz a la boca, distancia del labio superior al inferior, de un lado a otro, de la oreja, tal, por esos 150 puntos de reconocimiento facial y un algoritmo matemático, pues este programa, el Lobo Match, te selecciona de entre esas 200 donantes, pues a lo mejor 20, que se parecen físicamente a tu cara, ¿no?
¿Ustedes inventaron?
Esto lo inventó Amazon, o sea, realmente los reconocimientos faciales lo inventó Apple, o sea, esto está a la orden del día, ¿no? Entonces nosotros lo diseñamos para banco de óvulos y bueno, y es un paso intermedio entre poder ver la foto y no poder ver la foto. Al recibir tantos pacientes del mundo árabe, porque allí está prohibida la donación de óvulos, nosotros necesitamos buscar donantes fenotípicamente compatibles con estos pacientes, entonces donantes árabes.
Meanwhile, embryologist Enrique Criado has established ovum banks in the Ukraine and in Argentina. His ambition knows no bounds, and his eggs have no borders. They travel all over the globe.
Buongiorno Antonino, ho ricevuto la tua chiamata.
Receive your email if you could send me document number, passport or national ID.
Como banco de óvulos nos gustaría mandar a cualquier rincón del mundo, obviamente, siempre que sea legal, es decir, hay países, Emiratos Árabes, está prohibida la donación de óvulos. Por ejemplo, Alemania, uno de los países europeos donde estamos muy pendientes porque en Alemania la donación de óvulos está prohibida, la donación de semen está permitida y hay un movimiento para hacer cambiar la ley, ¿no? Entonces, si mañana cambia la ley en Alemania y se permite la donación de óvulos, seguramente, y ahí va a estar Ovobank, dentro de 10 años pues estaremos en todos los países donde se pueda hacer ovodonación. Entonces, estos contenedores tienen una parte muy especial, que es una parte de electrónica que hemos patentado nosotros para tener localizado en todo momento los óvulos que mandamos a los centros colaboradores. Entonces, los centros colaboradores, desde su aplicación, ¿no? Una aplicación, pues pueden ver perfectamente, por ejemplo, este envío, pueden ver las condiciones a las que están las células, qué presión atmosférica, qué humedad y, sobre todo, interesante, la posición GPS del contenedor. Estamos moviendo muchos óvulos, estamos exportando muchos óvulos, claro.
Entonces, en todo el mundo o en toda Europa
Estamos llevando la genética española, por supuesto, sí, eso por supuesto, ¿no? A lo mejor dentro de unos años todos los niños nacen con guitarra y cantando flamenco. Pero bueno, bromas aparte, la verdad que estamos muy orgullosos porque bueno, todos esos pacientes son padres gracias a un poquito con nuestra ayuda, ¿no?
Many people feel that fertility is not a huge pressing problem because for the last 30 years we've been talked about, be worried about overpopulation, limit the number of babies people should be having. But the reality of the new world is that populations are shrinking. Women are having fewer babies and they're having babies later. So the populations of Italy are shrinking. The population of the UK will level out very soon. Even China, that country that has been so worried about overpopulation and brought in legislation to control how many children you could have, China have realized they've got a big problem in the future. Their population will be leveling before the end of the century. So China is now the world center of fertility treatment. People may be surprised to hear that there are more IVF centers in China than in any other country in the world. And this is something we all need to be aware of, that actually it makes economic sense for us to replenish the population that are going to become taxpayers and going to look after all of us in our old age and pay our pensions. And governments are becoming aware of this.
So where does this leave governments, Lucy, when it comes to encouraging women to have children?
Yes, I think that's a very important question, because we need to think about fertility as not only a biological or an individual issue, but it's also a social and a political issue. You see, for example, that egg freezing is sometimes offered by governments who try to increase the birth rate. So certain areas in Japan, for example, have paid for women to freeze their eggs in the hope that they will then have more children. In other areas, IVF is promoted as a way of increasing the birth rate. And sometimes this is coupled to a nationalist or an anti-immigrant rhetoric. So we see that, for example, in Hungary, where Viktor Orban has taken fertility clinics under government control and is offering free IVF under the rubric of we don't want immigration, we want procreation. So we see that fertility and IVF is politicized in many different ways.
Once I was invited by the King of Spain, and he asked me, what do you think the biggest problem of Spain is? And he thought I was going to say the independent movements or the youth unemployment. And I said, this country is not having babies, and you're not going to have a kingdom. There's not going to be people in your kingdom. There's not going to be people in Spain. And indeed, the only reason there's people in Spain is thanks to immigrants. And massive immigration. By the way, I'm obviously for immigration. I'm an immigrant everywhere. I've been an immigrant in the US, an immigrant in Spain, and I speak as an immigrant. But having said this, I don't think the solution to a country can be to have your native population disappear and only have immigrants. I mean, I think the solution has to be some combination of more babies and immigrants. The only institutions that have decided to pay for egg freezing are the State of Israel and Apple, Facebook, Microsoft, Google, the largest US corporates. They also pay for egg freezing. So I think it's quite interesting that the large corporates and Israel came to the same conclusion, that it was a good thing for women to decide when to have a baby, but nobody else did.
We shouldn't lose sight of the causes of the fertility issue. It is lifestyle to some extent, but it's also very much environmental too. We live in a toxic world. We can't avoid the problems that the air we breathe to the food we eat are having, and it's generally estrogenic competing compounds. We call them endocrine bending compounds, endocrine changing compounds. They're affecting our fertility, they're affecting men's sperm counts, they're affecting the toxicity around the fluid around women's eggs. So we do live in a world where you combine the age at which a woman wants to start to have a child with a toxic world, and that's one of the big reasons why our fertility is going down.
Zo, hoe is het? Goed. Nou, we hebben 14 eicellen gevonden.
Oh, wauw.
Dus dat is een mooie opbrengst, denk ik.
Zeker.
Ja?
Nou, blij.
Nou,
ja.
Goed nieuws, toch?
Zeker,
ja,
heel.
Ja.
Ja, dat is eigenlijk mijn grootste spanning.
Ja, nee, natuurlijk. Logisch. Ja.
Ja. Jee. 14 geoogst. Oh. Ja, wat erg hè. Ik vind het echt een heel raar gesprek dit. Dat ik dan super blij ben dat ik 14 eieren heb geproduceerd. Ik voel me echt een soort kip.
Super goed, joh.
Ja, fijn.
Gefeliciteerd daarmee.
Nou, dankjewel. Denk ik.
Ik denk het ook. Ik denk het ook.
ik denk dat je voor jouw leeftijd een hele mooie score neerzet. Want er zijn ook vrouwen die maar 2 of 3 eitjes dan scoren.
Mooie score.
Dus
wauw.
Ik denk dat je het goed hebt gedaan dan, toch?
Ja, ik ben 26 voor altijd, dus dat
ja,
helpt.
26 plus, vind ik ook.
Ja.
Ik ook hoor. Blijf ik ook.